Hey, I'm Nathan Peifer. I manage the Wake Forest University campus garden. I'm here today with Madeline Coffey. Say hello, Madeline.
Hey, y'all.
With the Piedmont Environmental Alliance. We're just going to do a quick tour of the campus garden. This is a tour that I offer to students here at Wake Forest and to other community members. The campus garden was established in 2009. It was a cooperative venture between the Gloria Moudet Biology Lab. Dr. Moudet researches heirloom tomatoes and other tomatoes that she grows in her lab, looking at anthocyanin and how to make a more heat tolerant and drought tolerant tomato. The other partnership was a writing seminar. Students were interested in growing organic vegetables, and so they came out and started throwing seeds in the ground. This is my, I think, third season as the campus garden coordinator. We've got student volunteers usually who are here every day of the week for an hour helping to weed and plant and harvest. A little bit more about some of the other partnerships that we have. We work with Campus Kitchen, which is a student organization that goes around town picking up produce from grocery stores that is past its prime. And they bring that back to campus and prepare it into meals for social service agencies around town. Any of the food waste from that process then they bring out here to the campus garden where we compost it and get it back into the soil so we can grow more vegetables for Campus Kitchen. So our harvested vegetables go to Campus Kitchen. Volunteers are also welcome to take some of the bounty home with them. But more on that when we get to the compost pile. Where we're sitting right now is just our gathering area. We've got a few perennial herbs. We've got asparagus under the straw mulch there. So this is where we start the tour. Behind us you can see a cover crop. This is a rye cover crop. One of the things I love about the rye cover crop is you can plant it as late as like December or January. It just always wants to grow. So I'll show you a more mature stand of rye and vetch behind me. I would say that the campus garden is not on ideal land, right? The land slopes gently to the north and pretty dramatically to the east. And so some of the work that students have done recently is digging rain gardens and kind of working to terrace our garden into 3 plots. We have what we call the mountain plot, the Piedmont plot, and the coastal plot. Right? It kind of matches the geography of our state. So you'll notice a pretty dramatic elevation change. We've got some pretty severe slope. And so this is right behind us. These are our 2 rain gardens here. We've had a lot of water coming off of the grassy area and washing out our garden beds. So the gardener's first responsibility is to fight gravity, is to keep soil in place. So slowing water down as it moves across the land and giving it an opportunity to sink into the soil, permeate into the soil, is one of the most important things that a gardener does to prevent erosion. It has all kinds of ecological implications too that I'm happy to talk about at some other time.
So did you know all of this information before you started working at Wake Forest, or have you learned all of this through being in charge of the campus garden?
I did a Master of Divinity degree at Wake Forest from 2010 to 2013, and I did an internship here in 2012 in the campus garden with Dr. Moudet and with Dee Dee DeLongpre Johnston, our Chief Sustainability Officer, and the Divinity School, and that redirected the course of my life. I went to a community college and did a sustainable agriculture certificate. Worked on a few farms here in Forsyth County, and just started kind of learning as much as possible from reading books and watching YouTube videos. So we've got our rain gardens here. I had students dig them out, build up berms. This just helps us capture rainwater, slow it down, and prevent our garden beds from eroding. This was a semester project that got interrupted about halfway through. So the next task here is adding more compost and planting rain garden plants. Let's come on down this way. This is my favorite demonstration in the garden. This should be the first tool you get as a gardener, is a solid digging fork. It's really, really useful. So I usually ask a volunteer, and I won't because of our current situation. Ask a volunteer to come out and step the digging fork into the soil as far as they can. And when I'm stepping the fork into the sod here, our sod pathway where there's grass. So this is kind of like going out to your backyard and trying to step a fork into the soil. It's kind of difficult. You've really got to lean on it, and you can only get it about 2 or 3 inches deep. The soil is pretty well compacted, but in really good, healthy garden soil, you should be able to just step the fork all the way into the ground. And that's because what we want in our garden is English muffin soil. Right? English muffins are delicious because they have lots of nooks and crannies, right? And you can toast it up and it gets a little crispy and chewy, and you put butter on it and the butter melts down into those nooks and crannies. Right? Our garden soil should be the same way. Get a good sample. We want lots of nooks and crannies in our garden soil. Garden soil should be about 50% pore space, right? And the other 50% is sand, silt, clay, and organic matter. But hopefully you're able to see, this has nice, really nice soil aggregates. It's a rich brown chocolatey color, right? Which represents the presence of organic matter, right? So we're just constantly trying to put organic matter into our garden beds and keep soil light and fluffy. So if you just kind of pan around, you can see we use lots of wood mulch, we use lots of straw mulch, we use lots of compost. These are all sources of carbon, right? Organic matter that we're putting back into our soil to keep it light, fluffy, kind of like an English muffin soil. Have any thoughts or questions, Madeline, as we're going?
I think we're good for right now.
Yeah. So I guess one of the things that I should say is we do sustainability education here in the campus garden. The major point of this garden is to introduce students to how agriculture affects the climate. With a garden, the most important thing that we're doing is taking carbon from plant material, so trees, straw, living vegetables. We're taking carbon from the atmosphere through photosynthesis and putting that back into the garden soil, sequestering it in the ground, right? So adding carbon to the soil not only makes for a healthy garden soil, but it's also taking it out of the atmosphere, which is
cool.
Should be the... All right, so this is a cover crop of rye and vetch. A cover crop is a bunch of annual crops that are sown really close spacing, so that what you end up with is like a green blanket that covers the soil. I mentioned the gardener's primary task is to fight gravity, keep the soil in place. Soil is not a renewable resource. It was generated over geological time from our bedrock, right? And so we want to keep it in place. What a cover crop does is it covers the soil like a blanket. It holds that soil in place. It protects from wind erosion, water erosion. It protects from compaction, from rain events. We're also sequestering carbon through photosynthesis. And in another month or so, when this crop is mature, we'll mow it down and allow all of this organic residue to decompose at the soil surface before we plant our next crop into it. And all of the nutrients and all of the carbon that's in this cover crop will be made available to the next crop. So we're growing our fertility in place.
What's the next crop that's gonna go in this part of the garden?
This is gonna be our fall planting bed, so it's just gonna be a mix of cool season crops in the fall. Yep. Awesome. The most important plant nutrient for green leafy growth is nitrogen. I always ask students to take a deep breath. About 78% of that breath is nitrogen, but the molecules are bound together in a trivalent bond. It's super stable. So while the air is full of the most important plant nutrient for green leafy growth, the plants can't get to it because it's not plant accessible. Right, so they need some sort of partnership, something to break atmospheric nitrogen apart and turn it into a form of nitrogen that the plant can eat so that it can put on nice leafy growth like this.
So what are some ways of getting that critical nitrogen into the soil?
That's excellent. That's where we're going now. So vetch is a legume, much like soybeans or clover. And there's a bacteria in the soil, a family of bacteria in the soil that form a symbiotic relationship with plant roots of legumes, like in this case vetch. And that bacteria is capable of breaking apart atmospheric nitrogen and feeding it to the plant. So what I'm gonna try to find is some little nodules, root nodules. That's where the bacteria lives, inside of these nodules on the vetch root. Let's see if I can find some. We might have to find a more mature vetch plant. Let me go into the middle of the field here where the vetch is. Oh, there we go. Okay. I hope you can see it, right? Maintaining a safe social distance here. There are little pink nodules all over the root hairs. You see those little pink nodules? Yeah. This is super cool. Rhizobia bacteria has formed a symbiotic relationship with the roots of the vetch, right? And the bacteria is breaking apart atmospheric nitrogen, feeding it to the plant, and the plant in return is offering sugar, is giving sugars through its roots to the bacteria. I could talk for a long time about this if you have the capacity to save the video on your phone. So Second World War, right? We talk about the Green Revolution in agriculture. It goes back to two German physicists, Fritz Haber and Karl Bosch. They developed the Haber-Bosch process. They figured out a way to take atmospheric nitrogen, take air, and put it under intense heat and pressure with natural gas, methane. And they put in a catalyst, and what they're able to do is heat up and squeeze the air to the point where the nitrogen rips apart and reforms as a liquid nitrogen fertilizer. So this starts the green revolution in agriculture, where we see farmers using synthetically derived nitrogen fertilizers on crops. The production of that synthetic nitrogen fertilizer consumes about 2% of the world's energy annually. It's derived from methane, so natural gas, right? It's a fossil fuel intensive process. So agriculture that relies on the Haber-Bosch process to fertilize crops is, what would the word be? Environmentally detrimental. It's exacerbating climate change, right? Organic agriculture relies upon this symbiotic relationship between rhizobia and legumes to fix nitrogen from the air organically and feed it to the crops. It's also where we get the Impossible Burger. Have you had an Impossible Burger?
I have. I love Impossible Burgers.
Yeah, so food scientists figured out a way to, how to say this, the rhizobia bacteria produces leg hemoglobin, which is similar to the hemoglobin in our blood, right? It has that bloody irony taste. So food scientists figured out a way to produce this leg hemoglobin in a industrial kind of setting so that they can use that bacterially derived leg hemoglobin in the Impossible Burger. So we've got the bacteria responsible for the Impossible Burger here at the campus garden. I think that's pretty cool.
Very cool.
It's ubiquitous. You can find it anywhere. Very cool. So that's cover cropping. We got the compost piles right behind us. All right, we're here at the compost piles. I get a lot of questions about how do I compost at home. We have a relationship with Campus Kitchen that I mentioned earlier, where the students are collecting food waste from local grocery stores, bringing it back to campus, preparing it, and any of that food waste comes out here. So we have this steady supply of food waste. We're composting hundreds of pounds of food waste every month. And so what we've designed are 3 compost bins, quote unquote, out of straw bales. I got this technique from Elliot Coleman, the new organic grower. Elliot's kind of like the godfather of organic market gardening. But we use the straw bins to create a container for the organic matter. It insulates the pile, lets the pile heat up all the way to the edges, and it reduces the amount of turning that we have to do. If you can imagine, this is about 2 cubic yards of organic matter. It's a lot to turn, even with college-age volunteers. It's demanding work. And so the straw bales let us turn the pile less frequently. We turn each pile about twice. And so from there we can get into like the basics of composting. Food waste, straw, leaf mulch from campus, sometimes wood chips, sometimes garden residue from our plants. We mix that all into the pile here at a ratio of about 3 parts brown material, that's carbon rich material like wood chips, straw, leaf mulch, to 1 part food waste. So about a 3-to-1 ratio, a 2-to-1 ratio you'll also hear. Just kind of got to experiment with that. It also depends on what you have at hand. We're really fortunate that campus landscaping team brings out leaf mulch for us every year, as well as wood chips. So if you're going to be composting at home, make sure you have access to carbon rich material, lots of leaves, lots of straw. What we're doing is creating an environment for soil bacteria. So, you know, some farmers have sheep, some farmers have chicken. What we've got here is bacteria, soil bacteria. And if you'll come down here, this is the pile that we're building. Typically this pile would be as high as the sign right now. We've just lost our, stream of food waste, but food waste is being typically added to this pile. Then we've got a second pile where we've added food waste. The temperature has heated up. The bacteria are decomposing all of that organic waste, right? And we're letting it rest and do its work. And then this third pile here is finished compost that's ready to be sifted and taken into the field. So what's going on between building the pile, letting the pile work, and having finished compost is that soil bacteria is kind of inoculating and inhabiting this pile. In just a handful of compost, there are trillions of microorganisms at work breaking apart all of this organic waste. When the organisms are really happy, when we've got that nice ratio of carbon to nitrogen, and when there's an adequate amount of moisture and oxygen, right? It's like exercising. When we go to the gym and exercise, we start to sweat, our respiration increases. The same thing is going on inside this pile. The bacteria are exercising. They're happy. They're in a happy environment. So if you can see, our thermometer is at 60 degrees. In a new pile, we're gonna see the temperature, once we build up a new pile, get up to 140, 150 degrees. About 4 weeks ago, this pile was at 150 degrees. Over time, the pile will start to cool off. And now this pile is at it'll get up to about 100 degrees, right? It's starting to cool down.
Can you tell when the compost is ready to be used in the garden based on what temperature it is?
Yeah, so the tools that we have for making sure the compost is ready for the garden are our noses, our hands, and this nifty soil or compost thermometer. It's got a nice long probe so you know what's going on in the middle of the pile. What we want to see with our compost, we want new compost piles to, within 3 to 5 days, heat up to about 140, 150 degrees Fahrenheit. It'll stay at that for about a week or so. As the microorganisms start to consume all the oxygen in the pile, that temperature will start to drop. And we'll see it get back down into the 100s, 120. If we wanted to get this temperature up again, we would turn the pile, incorporate more oxygen, and get those microorganisms going again, and the pile could come up again into the 130s, 140s.
So if you're doing this in your backyard and it's not getting to the temperature that you need it to be at, you should be messing with it,
What's
turning
going
it,
on? There's
right?
some, it could be oxygen. You might need to turn your pile and incorporate oxygen. Your pile might not be large enough. A cubic yard, so a 3 foot by 3 foot by 3 foot cube, is the minimum recommended pile size for a thermophilic compost pile for a pile that heats up to about 150 degrees or so. So for instance, the pile that we started behind you, we just haven't had enough organic waste coming into the garden to build a pile large enough for those organisms to get really happy and generate lots and lots of heat. So it could be the size of your pile. The pile could be too wet if you smell like stinky food waste, right? If you're using your nose and the pile stinks, it might be too wet, and you probably need to add more carbon, so more of that brown matter, leaves or straw. Yeah, it's fun. Composting is really fun because it's an interactive process. It's you and the bacteria interacting, and you're trying to create an ideal environment for those bacteria to live and do their decomposition work. Yeah. The pile should be ambient temperature though when it's finished. So this pile over here should be like 60, 70 degrees. And it should smell earthy and rich. I always ask students to take a big whiff. Can you smell food waste? No, but you're standing next to a couple 100 pounds of food waste, but you shouldn't be able to smell it. In a finished pile, oh, it should smell rich and organic and earthy. There's actually a bacteria that creates that smell. So you know that your pile is, when it's rich and earthy. It's really good stuff. I'm excited. Again, it's important to add organic matter like this into your garden because it helps you create that English muffin soil, right? A soil that has lots of nice texture and nooks and crannies and holds together. It's more resilient. So I can't say that enough. Getting organic matter into your garden is really, really important. We've got some sugar beets here. This was part of an art class that was looking at landscapes in the colonial period, thinking about ways that commodities like tobacco and corn and sugarcane transform the landscape. So we're growing some sugar beets. We've also got some tobacco seeded. We're gonna grow some tobacco this year. Again, thinking about the importance of tobacco in the history of North Carolina and in the South in general. I didn't realize how small tobacco seed was until we did this, but you can see some of the seedlings just starting to pop. Teeny tiny. Again, I've got them sitting on top of the compost pile, hoping that the compost pile will keep them a little bit warmer.
I hear a lot of people ask, you know, if I go to Camino and I get a biodegradable plastic cup, does this mean that I have to send it to Gallon's Family Farm to be composted in an industrial composter, or can I compost it in a backyard compost pile?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. We do get biodegradable plastics. So you can see on the end of this fork, it says 100% compostable. It's made out of a corn-based plastic called PLA, polylactic acid. And what's really super interesting is about the biodegradable plastics. It's not a biological process that breaks down the substance. So I could throw a carrot in my compost pile, or I could throw a paper plate in my compost pile, and it's the bacterial organisms in the pile, as well as some other larger organisms that are going to shred that material apart and break it down into smaller and smaller pieces. With PLA, what initially starts the decomposition process is heat and moisture. So in our piles, because they are about 2 cubic yards in size and the center of the pile does heat up to about 150 degrees, we are capable of breaking down PLA. But every now and then we get a fork that was maybe on the edge of the pile or something that ends up in the finished compost. So it's best if this stuff can be sent to an industrial composting facility like Gallon's, because they have extremely large windrows that are mechanically turned, and the chance of this plastic being exposed to the temperatures that it needs to be exposed to start the chemical decomposition process is far more likely in that kind of environment. But again, I encourage you to experiment. See if you can compost PLA at home. It's pretty amazing to see. Sometimes you'll pull a fork out of the compost and half of it was exposed to the heat at the center of the pile, and then part of it was in a cool spot, and it'll look all like bended and melty and gnarly. So that's the big takeaway. Is this is PLA. It's a corn-based plastic. It decomposes first chemically by exposure to heat and moisture, and then after that, it's a biological process. And so the big thing with composting PLA is heat and moisture. Very good. Let's take a pause and go somewhere else in the garden. This is broccoli.
Neat.
That needs to be weeded, but all my weeding volunteers are elsewhere, at home, very healthy.
Nathan, are community members allowed to volunteer here or just students?
Yeah, volunteers are welcome here at the campus garden. We have open volunteer hours on Sundays from 4 to 6. When the time changes in the fall, we'll go back to 3 to 5. Typically, it's student volunteers. If you'd like to bring a community group out to the campus garden, I'd encourage you to send me an email. You can find my information at sustainability.wfu.edu. We are primarily an educational garden, and we do have student volunteer groups come out quite regularly, but I love working with community members. Any opportunity I get to talk about the garden, like, this is what I love, so I always welcome folks out to the garden if I'm around. Yep. What we're standing on top of right now are strawberries. So when you're thinking about like school gardens, elementary school, middle school, college, school gardens, the important thing to do is grow fall and spring crops when everyone's around. And strawberries are great because we plant them in kind of September, October, and they grow through the winter, and they're dormant through the winter, and then in the spring they put on a flush of new growth. And so maybe Aaron caught it. Our strawberry blossoms are just starting to come out. The yellow part there at the center of the flower will be a strawberry in a couple months. And we've got these hoops over the strawberries as well as some plastic. If temperatures drop below freezing at night here, once the strawberries have put on these flower buds, we'll cover them up to protect them from frost. So a late frost is bad news for a strawberry grower.
Do you use the Farmer's Almanac to determine how you grow this garden?
No, I don't use the Farmer's Almanac. I've got one. Check it out. The basic information that you need to know are our first and last frost dates. Just for convenience, I always think of April 15th as our last frost date and October 31st as our first frost date. And that changes every year, especially now as the climate changes and warms. What I'm noticing are, I don't anticipate another frost here. We're at the end of March. I feel confident putting in like early spring crops, and I don't think we'll get a late frost. But the scary thing is, like, somebody growing strawberries is, what if that late frost comes through in the second week of April or the first week of April? You've really got to be prepared to protect your crop at that point in the event of some sort of like anomalous weather. Things are just a little more unstable. Rain is the big one for our region and farming. We prepare all of our beds in the fall for our spring plantings because the springs have been exceptionally wet for the most part. And so getting into the field, you don't want to get into a wet field because you compact the soil. Anytime you put pressure on it, wet soil will compact easily. And again, we want English muffin soil.
Right.
We'll head over here to the bees. The honeybees are kept by David Link. David Link operates Hidden Meadow Apiary, or Hidden Meadows Farm. I've got an excellent hand balm that he makes that I keep in my pocket out here, but he also sells honey and other products from his bees. He's our beekeeper. We have three hives. We're gonna walk around to the side. So I always tell students, if you don't want to be stung by a bee, don't go in front of their doorway. We're very protective of the little door at the bottom right corner of the box, or bottom left corner of the box. These are our pollinators. I see the impact of the pollinators most when we grow squash. Our squash tends to germinate, or tends to be pollinated more effectively. We tend to get a larger yield of squash when we've got the bees around. They're just fantastic pollinators. So.
What can you do to attract more pollinators if you don't have backyard beekeeping?
Yeah, and you know, folks will have to double check me on this, but the majority of our native bees are ground dwelling, so they're not disturbing soil, using lots of mulches. Just protecting that habitat is one of the most important things we can do. Reducing the use of pesticides, whether it's your lawn or in your garden, anything we can do to lower the level of stress that bees experience. It's really important. So planting habitat, what we're working on, it's not real pretty, but it's here, we're working on it, is a perennial hedgerow in between our annual production plots. And our hope is that this perennial hedgerow will provide early pollen sources and early nectar sources for the bees, as well as habitat for beneficial insects like ladybugs and parasitic wasps. We don't spray any of our crops with herbicides or pesticides. What we depend upon are beneficial insects that eat other nuisance insects. My favorite example is the tomato hornworm. We've got a parasitic wasp that will lay its eggs inside of the hornworm, and maybe we can edit in a picture of this later on because it's so cool. These hornworms can grow, you know, larger than your thumb. They're quite large, and they'll defoliate a tomato plant overnight. They'll just eat the leaves off of a plant overnight. But it's satisfying if you're a gardener to come out and see this big tomato hornworm, and they'll have little white, they look like little white cocoons on them. And what happened there was a parasitic wasp laid its eggs inside of the caterpillar. They hatched, the larva ate out the inside of the caterpillar, and then they pupate on the outside of the caterpillar and hatch from there and populate your garden with the wonderful parasitic wasps that rid you of tomato hornworms. So we're looking for fantastic partnerships like that. I know that was a little bit graphic, but you know, life and death in the garden is a daily experience. And so it's just one of the realities of being in the garden. Ladybugs can eat thousands of aphids in a day. So ladybugs are another great beneficial insect. So that's the hope here, is that we can continue to kind of develop this as a perennial hedgerow between our annual plots for the bees and for the beneficial insects. Garlic is another one of these great school garden crops. You plant it in the fall, it kind of goes dormant over the winter time, and then in the spring grows again. So you can see our little garlic crop.
It smells garlicky over here.
Ooh, it's starting to bulb. It's just starting to bulb. So you buy your head of garlic at the grocery store. If you break apart the bulb into little garlic bulbs, you just plant one bulb. We do 3 rows, but that bulb eventually will form a new head of garlic. So this can be eaten as green garlic. That's probably what I'll take it home and chop it up, eat it as green garlic. All right, y'all, we're here at another rain garden that students dug. You can see in this garden, we actually have some rain garden plants established. There's a blue stem grass, sea oats. We put lemon balm. I don't know if you stick your hand in the lemon balm. It just overwhelms your senses with lemon.
Gosh.
Yeah, it's incredible. So
That's
we've got some lemon
awesome.
balm, cup flower, and some other native flowers. Again, establishing perennial flowers for bees and beneficial insects. Some of the other cool things that we do in the campus garden, weed control is really, really important. So we've stopped tilling as much as possible. We used to do something called double digging, where you remove the top few inches of soil, go down and kind of open the soil up a little bit more, add some compost and put the soil back. The idea is there is to create deep kind of English muffiny soil What we found doing that though is we just dig up more weed seeds, and so our carrots last fall were just overwhelmed by weeds in our double dug beds. So we use lots of compost. You can see the compost on top of these beds here. We use lots of wood mulch in the aisles. We're trying to disturb our soil as little as possible to keep those weed seeds in the ground. The other thing we do, this is called occultation. You're just depriving the soil of light. So we lay out this big strip of plastic. This was in a winter cover crop, spring oats. So we grew the oats in the fall. When hard frost came through this winter, it killed the oats back. Some of them survived because we didn't have a lot of hard freezes this winter. And so I came in and weed whacked those oats and covered it with the plastic. Soil organisms come up and decompose all of that cover crop residue. And then any weeds that germinate, so our spring weeds under there, the plastic makes the soil a little warmer and the seeds germinate, but they're deprived light and so they die. So it's one of those ways where we can get a flush of weeds to come up and die before we even plant a crop. And so that's been really effective for us, and we can move this tarp from plot to plot to plot and perform occultation. It's kind of a cool technique for controlling weeds. It also has the added benefit of warming the soil in the spring. So the next crop that's going to go in here are early tomatoes around April 15th after the threat of frost. And that soil should be a few degrees warmer than soil that's not covered, and the tomatoes will really appreciate that. The other thing we have is season extension. We just finished building this little high tunnel. We've got to put the greenhouse plastic over it. But the idea with the high tunnel is that we're going to be able to start lettuces in February when it's still pretty cold inside that greenhouse-like high tunnel. And then as the weather warms up and those lettuce plants mature, we'll be able to move the high tunnel to the second half of the plot sometime in like early mid-March, and plant early tomatoes so we can get super early tomatoes underneath of the high tunnel. I'm excited just to have tomatoes early, you know, not to have to wait till June or July to get tomatoes. But that's called season extension. So using greenhouse plastic and other materials to get your crop started earlier in the season and carry it later into the fall to get harvested. The other thing you see on the ground are our drip tape. So irrigation in the spring isn't really vital just because of how wet our springs are, but as our spring crops mature later into the spring and early summer, they will need irrigation. We use this plastic drip tape. It has emitters every 12 inches that drip a 1/4 gallon of water per hour. And so we're able to measure how much water we're putting onto a bed because we know how much water these emitters are emitting. The nice thing about this is that instead of spraying water up into the air where it's lost to evaporation, it drips the water directly onto the soil. And then it's kind of like blowing up a balloon. If you can imagine a balloon expanding, when drops of water hit the soil, they start to expand underground. So drip tape actually, you may only see little pockets of water on top of the soil, but underground that water is expanding to fill the entire rooting area of our crop. So this is a way of conserving water. I think that'll about do it. Do y'all have questions?
I'm good.
A lot.
This is
a
awesome.
lot.
Yeah, I feel really excited.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for taking this video, and thanks Nathan for explaining all of this awesome stuff to us.
Yeah, my pleasure. There's so much to learn. I think that's why people love gardening. For those of us who love it, it's because we're constantly learning. Every season's a new opportunity to figure out how to grow vegetables and how to work with the environment to produce something that's hopefully both beautiful and delicious and nutritious. That's one of the goals too, is that aesthetic ambition is I want to create something beautiful and attractive and nourishing for not only human beings, but all of the different biological organisms that we're working with out here in the garden. Thanks.